Want to read out a piece in the Sunday Times from about a week ago. I'll just get the exact date. It is still in the big broadsheet format, so it's trying to unravel the Brazilian rainforest. But it's from October the 13th, so about a week ago, just over a week ago. I want to read out a piece regarding the BBC World Service. Now, time permitted, I might make a broader video about the BBC. I've probably done that before, but it's probably time for an update. My thoughts on the BBC. Basically, I'm critical of some aspects of the BBC, but I don't want to see it go completely. That's how I feel about it. At its best, I think the BBC is the best, but I also go along with some of the skepticism that's out there. I see where that comes from. Um, okay, I'm just going to get into this and then share my thoughts because I think this is an extremely important issue. BBC boss: funding cuts aid Russian and Chinese all-out assault on truth. This report's by Rosamund Irwin and Harry York. I'll read it out then, share my thoughts as always. And in fact, I will take a drink first because just realised it's a bit mm, too painful mouth ulcers at the moment. So, the Director General of the BBC will warn that cuts to its funding have led to Russia and China broadcasting on-challenge propaganda. In a speech tomorrow, Tim Davie will say that the world faces an all-out assault on truth, and hostile states have rushed to fill any vacuum left by the withdrawal of the BBC World Service. The broadcaster is asking the Foreign Office for an extra £50 million next year to fund the World Service, which has cut foreign language services as its budget has been squeezed. Speaking at the Future Resilience Forum in central London, Davie will say, "What we are facing is an all-out assault on truth worldwide. We can now see clear evidence of the fact that when the World Service retreats, state-funded media operators move in to take advantage. Russia and China are spending an estimated $6 billion to $8 billion a year on foreign media activities abroad, promoting their view of the world to audiences in Africa, the Middle East and Latin America in particular. Research shows that the state-backed broadcasters are becoming more trusted sources of information in countries such as Nigeria, Egypt, Yemen and Iran. In Lebanon, Russian-backed media transmit on a radio frequency previously used by BBC Arabic, which closed down in January 2023. Last month, BBC monitoring listened to the Russian input after Israeli planted explosives and pagers and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah exploded across Lebanon. What they heard was unchallenged propaganda, Davie will say. Had the BBC been able to retain our impartial radio output, these messages would have been much harder for local audiences to find. In this context, the further retreat of the BBC World Service should be a cause for serious global concern. The BBC said its former broadcasting partners in Jordan, the Palestinian territories, Iraq, Lebanon and Mauritania have been approached by Chinese Radio International and Sputnik, which is owned by the Russian state, to use the corporation's former slots. Sputnik, I would also point out, was fronted by one George Galloway, former MP. I was going to say MP, lost the seat, thank goodness. After the Conservative government froze the licence fee in 2022, the BBC announced cuts to its World Service output, including ending radio services in Chinese, Hindi and Arabic. BBC executives, including Davie and Jonathan Munro, Global Director of News, have met David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, I think his name's pronounced, my apologies, to discuss funding of the World Service for the last financial year. The licence fee provided £265 million and the government £101 million of a £366 million annual budget. Whitehall sources say the Foreign Office is receptive to the BBC's argument that there is a battle of the airwaves and hostile states, and Lammy wants to find more funding for the World Service, with a decision to be announced in the budget on October the 30th. But the BBC is likely to face fresh scrutiny about the value and impartiality provided by its news coverage overseas, given that it has to compete with misinformation that spreads swiftly on platforms such as TikTok and X. It's faced repeated accusations of bias, including in its coverage of the Israel-Gaza war. I've addressed that point. I really think that BBC is in a difficult position there because it's had roughly the same number of complaints from pro-Israelis and pro-Palestinians. Davie has made clear what he does not believe the World Service should be funded through the licence fee. Has made clear that he does not believe the World Service should be funded through the licence fee. At the Royal Television Society convention in London last month, he said the World Service needs to be funded outside the licence fee. The government and us have a real choice around soft power and the UK's mojo abroad. The BBC's funding is under pressure. About 500,000 households cancelled the licence fee last year as the broadcaster lost younger viewers to Netflix and YouTube, according to its annual report published in July. This is adding to concerns over the high salaries of presenters, including the Match of the Day host Gary Lineker, who topped the BBC pay list with an annual salary of more than £1.35 million. Lineker, 63, is negotiating with the BBC over a new contract amid speculation he could leave the corporation next year. The Future Resilience Forum was founded by Fiona Hill, Theresa May's former Joint Chiefs of Staff, to discuss challenges facing the world. So there's a lot to take in there. I've recently seen a BBC ad talking about tackling false information, and frankly, I was troubled to see that the number of laughing emojis outweighed the number of likes. Now, there is a lot of people in this country who are tired of the BBC. They do see it as arrogant and out of touch. Let's just address the elephant in the room. That's the truth. And the license fee issue is controversial because, particularly the aspect around criminal sanctions if you don't pay it, I think that is an absolute disgrace. But the BBC does need to be funded, and remember, BBC programmes don't have advertising in the same way that other channels do. Now, sticking specifically to the BBC World Service, I remember when RT was broadcasting in this country, and it was nothing but undiluted Kremlin propaganda. I mean, I saw through it pretty early on, but a lot of people continued to defend it. I think Ofcom took far too long to take action against it. I don't see any valid reason why we should allow a hostile state, a powerful hostile state, to put out the propaganda on our airwaves with the intention of trying to stoke up division in this country. Because what RT would do, aside from latching on to conspiracy theories that were not actually having any basis in terms of factual news, they would latch on to the culture wars, for example, and they would really, really try and wage a division. And if you think I'm wrong, consider their reporting of the West. It was entirely negative. Anything that they were talking about regarding the British government, the French government, the American government, or even institutions in Western countries was wholly negative. They never ever had anything critical to say about Putin. When they covered the Russian election, they treated it like a normal election, totally evading the nature of Russian politics. I think RT is toxic. But it's not just RT. Russia has had a very assertive and very aggressive propaganda outreach, particularly to the global south. I'm not surprised, I'm depressed, but I'm not surprised that a lot of people in developing countries latch on to what they hear on Russian state propaganda. I think some of this is because of kind of post-colonial resentment against France and Britain. But there has to be more to it than that. I think Russia is actively wedging in there. So I do think the BBC World Service is extremely important. I recall, I haven't heard it for a long time, but I recall when I did periodically listen to it, there was that sort of familiar introduction. This is the BBC in Kampala. This is the BBC in Nairobi. This is the BBC in Karachi. This is the BBC World Service in Los Angeles, in Singapore, and so on. And in terms of global outreach, the BBC was the most extensive network in the world. It's certainly the oldest major network in the world, and it's one of the best known. Now, of course, people will say, well, the BBC is biased. But I would implore people to really, really look at this argument and ask yourselves, is the BBC a mouthpiece of the British government? It's clearly not. You cannot say the same for Chinese state propaganda and Russian state propaganda. You just can't. In fact, if anything, the BBC has often been accused of lacking patriotism. It's often been accused of trying to be too neutral. I do think an organisation as big as the BBC is going to be condemned no matter what approach it does take. But I agree with Davie. The BBC World Service is vital. Um, it's interesting that he said the licence fee shouldn't be the way it's funded. Perhaps he's being assertive about how unpopular the licence fee is. I don't know. Um, but put it this way, I certainly trust the BBC more than a lot of stuff that goes on X or platforms like Telegram. Certainly more than Chinese state outlets. I mean, what you'll find with RT and also, I remember when CGTN used to be broadcasting in Britain, both are now defunct. And as a matter of transparency, I will say that I campaigned to get CGTN taken off our airwaves because they broadcast basically a kangaroo trial of a British citizen um, who was accused of espionage, and it was a show trial. CGTN staged that. I don't think such networks that aid dictatorships should be allowed a free rein on our airwaves. You know, free speech is important, but if we are actually enabling totalitarian regimes to silence dissidents effectively by only allowing their one voice, then it's really ridiculous. It's shooting ourselves in the foot. I think that's tolerance going too far. David Lammy was in China recently. He met officials in Beijing and he met British trade representatives in Shanghai. I agree with the Times editorial. Dealing with China is not a simple thing. I do think we need to take a much harder line with the Chinese regime in a lot of areas, but totally cutting off ties with China probably isn't realistic. It isn't just for the economic interdependence, but it's also for the fact if you did have British citizens, for example, in trouble in China, if we had no connections, it would be even harder, for example, to secure the release. That's why we still have diplomatic ties with Iran. But I do favour getting harder with China and certainly not, certainly pushing back when they come out with their so called wolf warrior rhetoric. I think we should push back, for example, with incidents like that happened at the Manchester consulate 2 years ago. Um, we cannot allow bullying regimes like those in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran to do as they please. Now, there'll be people in this country as well who are just anti BBC and they won't care. They'll say, oh, the BBC is getting what it deserves. Um, I would suggest that they really, really, really think about this. Um, they may say the BBC's got a left wing bias, and those who are pro Israel will say it's an anti Israel bias. I don't actually think that's fair. I do think that it's very misguided, as I've said before, not to call groups like Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist organizations. But there is another argument there, which is about access. Now, if BBC journalists are going to be interviewing, for example, Hamas representatives, if they're calling them terrorists, and that is going to actually put them in danger as well. Um, so there's a lot of things to consider, but I certainly think funding for the World Service is extremely important in terms of British soft power. Otherwise, we're going to have a situation where we may no longer have RT and CGTN, but they'll be creeping in elsewhere around the world, and they absolutely cannot be trusted because they are the mouthpieces of dictatorships. That is a fact. That is a fact. You will not get an objective. I see comments online praising these outlets, and I just despair because it's the exact opposite of objective. CGTM will say whatever Xi Jinping approves of. RT will just be a mouthpiece for Putinism. The BBC World Service is not a mouthpiece for the British government, but it is a strong example of British soft power, and I think it needs to be given support. I'm not saying it's easy, but the government certainly needs to seriously consider this. So it's good that David Lammy's receptive to this issue. That's how I feel about it. I appreciate not everyone will agree. There'll be people who are very anti BBC. I would simply say consider the alternatives. I mean, I'm not talking about GB News, which is relatively small scale by comparison. I'm talking about hostile foreign states that are pumping out lies, not just about everything, effectively. I mean, if you seriously believe what is coming from the Chinese Communist Party, or Putin's regime, then I feel sorry for you. I really do. The BBC World Service is, in my opinion, world-class journalism, and it needs to be supported. This is not more broadly about the BBC. That's for another video. The BBC deserves plenty of criticism. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm talking specifically about the BBC World Service.